Welcome back to our Firestop coffee break. In this discussion, we're going to talk about a part of the Firestop installation that is often overlooked, not well understood, and has the potential to be a critical element of your Firestop installations. What we're talking about is mineral wool. Before we do, however, I want to ask you a question. Have you had any training on Firestop before? If you have, that's awesome. But I have a question for you. Who delivered that training? More likely than not, it was a Firestop manufacturer. Well, let's think about this for a minute. What are they selling? Firestop, right? Are they selling mineral wool? Probably not. I mean, if you get your product from a supply house, then yes. But is your supply house doing the training on Firestop, or is it the manufacturer? It's probably the manufacturer, right? In this longer training, we'll look at the anatomy of a Firestop system, and you'll see that many of the details will require two components: mineral wool and Firestop sealant. That's the traditional Firestop installation. So when it comes to Firestop and floor assemblies, typically you'll either see a thick depth of Firestop, or you'll see that there are often two materials in the system. There's a Firestop sealant, which we've talked a fair bit about, and then there's this other material. Did you know that mineral wool does the lion's share of the work? Did you know that the proper depth of mineral wool can be a critical element in your Firestop application? The Firestop manufacturers only touch on this because they're trained on their Firestop products. So that's what they're training you on. Now don't get me wrong, if the detail calls for both materials, they are both important. If they call for a depth of mineral wool and they call for a depth of Firestop sealant, then clearly getting both of these right is going to be important. Mineral wool may not be required on every installation, but when it is required, you need to be sure to get this element right, because there are a few important things that you need to know about. First of all, is that mineral wool is often the workhorse of your Firestop details, and if you want to do your job right, you need to pay attention to this. Did you know that there are 5 rules of mineral wool that a fire sprinkler contractor needs to know about? If you're a general contractor or an inspector dealing with fire-rated joints or any large openings, there are more rules. But this training is looking just at what a fire sprinkler installation needs. So we're going to stick to that. First, you need to pay attention to the brand, the density, be sure it's tightly packed, and then the last two are depth and depth. Wait, I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but give me a minute and we'll get to it. We need to take these one at a time. But first, let's talk about how this stuff is made, because it's so cool and it'll give you a better understanding of the differences between the various brands. First, I want you to think about the last time that you were at a county fair. Did you get cotton candy? If you were with kids, I bet you did. Do you remember that sticky, sweet stuff that would cover your face and maybe your fingers? Remember that sweet smell that would make you want it even more? Well, have you ever seen how they make that stuff? They take sugar and they heat it until it's a liquid, and then they spin it into these light, fluffy tufts. Well, they do the same thing when they make fiberglass, and also to make mineral wool. For cotton candy, they put sugar and color and maybe some flavoring. There may be variations in this, but these are the general things. So at first blush, mineral wool is similar. But the truth is, mineral wool products are not all the same. There are 2 primary elements in mineral wool. One is basalt rock, and that's formed after a volcano erupts. And the other is slag, which is junk from steel manufacturing. And it's kind of cool because they're recycling it to make mineral wool. Now, most people in construction think that mineral wool is all the same. Guess what? They're not. Let's take 2 popular brand names. One has more slag and less basalt, and the other has more of that volcanic rock and less of that steel waste. They'll take their proprietary combination of these 2 ingredients, they'll melt them down into a super hot lava, and then they spin it just like cotton candy. Only it's a whole lot hotter and it doesn't smell the same, and you are certainly not going to want to eat it. So you can see there are a few differences in this lava, but in addition to that, there are things such as fiber optimization and the binder or the glue that holds everything together. And both of those are going to impact the fire performance. Some Firestop details will list certain brands of mineral wool, so you'll want to make sure that that's what's being used on your project if that's the case. When we keep going with our list, the next thing is density. Mineral wool comes in 2, 4, 6, and 8 pound density, but you can only use 2 of them when you're fire stopping for through penetrations. That would be a 4 pound and a 6 pound density. The 2 pound density is used in roofing and acoustical applications. So if you see this stuff on your project, make sure that you don't think, oh look, random mineral wool, let's use that scrap stuff that's laying around. 2-pound density is not tested for firestop applications, and neither is 8-pound density. But the 8-pound stuff is really firm and rigid, and the chances that you're going to even try and use it in a firestop, especially for penetrations, it's unlikely. But just in case you think that you're being resourceful and using all of the materials, which I'm typically all for, please don't do that in this case because it's the wrong material. Now, of course, when mineral wool is required, you cannot substitute it for anything else. You can't use backer rod. You can't use fiberglass. You can't use newspaper, dirty rags. These are all things that I've seen in firestop applications. If the detail calls for minimum 4-pound density, you can use 4 and 6-pound. But if you look at the details for 8-pound density mineral wool, you'll see that it hasn't been tested ASTM 814, which is the test for firestop penetrations. So you can't use 8-pound density mineral wool. But like I said, you probably don't want to use it anyways because it's so tough to work with. The other reason most people use 4-pound density for mineral wool applications is simply because it's the easiest stuff to work with. The firestop detail will say the mineral wool needs to be tightly packed. Now there are a few reasons for this. One is that if it's not tightly packed, it can easily fall out of the opening over time. 2 is if it's not tightly packed, it may not be able to prevent the thermal transfer that the system requires. Sometimes people think that the reason for the mineral wool compression is that it increases the density. And while that is actually going to happen, it is not at all the reason for the compression requirements. The compression requirements, particularly in a fire resistance rated joint application, helps allow for any sort of movement without worry that the material will become dislodged over time. Remember in the XHEZ section, we discussed the M ratings and the movement. Whether your firestop system is tested to an M rating or not, you cannot deny that it'll be subject to movement. So please be sure that the mineral wool in your firestop installations, when it is required, is tightly packed so that you'll know it will stay in place. Also be sure that you have the proper density, even the right brand, so that you know that it will function as it's expected. So that covers the brand, the density, and the tightly packed. Next up, we need to talk about the mineral wool depth in 2 different ways. Let's go to our trusty chalkboard. Let's say that this is our concrete floor, and here is our metal pipe. Let's assume that the firestop installation that you're dealing with allows for a metal pipe in a concrete floor, and that your floor is going to be 6 inches of concrete. And your firestop detail calls for 4 inches of mineral wool, and on top of that, you need a 1/2 inch depth of firestop sealant. So here's what happens if they're doing a good job. They're going to install the 4-inch depth of mineral wool, but they'll recess it down from the top surface so that they can get the 1/2 inch depth of firestop sealant right here. What happens altogether too often is when they come in, they're in a hurry to get all the work done. I totally get it, but they're not careful. And what happens is they throw the mineral wool in there. And if you can get in there in that magic point between when the mineral wool is installed and before the firestop sealant goes in, then you can see into the future. If they don't recess the mineral wool, then when the guy comes along with the firestop sealant, they're just going to smear it across the top. And they're not going to have that required 1/2 inch depth. That's important. So if they're going along and installing the sealant, maybe they are recessing the mineral wool and then installing the sealant. If they aren't, however, there's a very good chance that they're not going to be getting the required sealant depth. And you want to make sure you're paying attention to this. It doesn't matter if you're quality control, if you're the general contractor, or if you're the special inspector, if you're the AHJ, if you're the AOR. It doesn't matter who you are. If you care anything about life safety, this is going to be important. Because if they don't do this right, if they don't recess the mineral wool, the chances of them getting it done right, quite frankly, they tend to be dismal. So if you're walking a site in that space between the time when the mineral wool is installed and the firestop is installed, take a peek and see what things look like. Then let me know what you find. And if you reach out and send me a photo so that we can use that in our training, I just might be able to give you a few more pointers depending on what we see in the photo. So now you might know a little bit more about the mineral wool installation than you did a few minutes ago. That means that our firestop coffee break training is over for now. Unless, of course, you're in binge watch mode, in which case I will see you in the next video.